Good afternoon and welcome to the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force webinar on securing and enhancing the ICT supply chain. My name is Mara Wynn and I'm the Associate Director at the National Risk Management Center and co-chair of the ict-scrm-task-force. We are so glad that you could join us for what promises to be an informative discussion on current ICT supply chain resilience issues, as well as some of the efforts currently underway that are meant to increase ICT resilience and security. Furthermore, our panelists will share ways today in which the private sector and industry can work together to address issues that are important and vital to the ICT sector. As I've seen in my work with the ict-SCRM task force, when we work together, we can make real progress on identifying, analyzing, and creating solutions that can enhance this sector that is so vital and important to our national and economic security. In fact, the task force is currently working on a number of products that will be released in the coming months, including HBOMs, hardware bill of materials, and SBOM, software bill of material templates, a software assurance buyer's guide, as well as guidance and framework documents that small and medium-sized businesses can utilize to identify and analyze ICT-related supply chain risks. Once each of these products is released, we will hold webinars to discuss them in more detail and to gain your feedback. So please watch your inboxes for these invites. I want to now turn this webinar over to my wonderful compatriot on the task force, Robert Mayer, who will be moderating the panel discussion. For those of you who don't know, Robert is the Senior Vice President of Cybersecurity and Innovation at US Telecom, and he is also the co-chair of the ICT Supply Chain Task Force, where we really value all of his hard work and guidance. Please enjoy the webinar, and Robert, over to you.
Mara, thank you very much. And I want to begin, first of all, by thanking the hundreds of folks who registered and are participating in this panel. I also want to recognize Laura, you and your support team at CISA for putting this effort together and for getting such a wonderful group of panelists to participate. I'm going to make up some time by going a little fast in the introductions. I think what you will hear today is not only the wonderful work that's being done through the partnership with CISA and other government agencies who participate in the task force, but also an understanding of where we are right now in the supply chain, what continues to drive the problem. I mean, we all know about COVID-19 and what disruptions that created, and you'll hear more about that in what we've studied, but the problem continues for not only that reason, but for other reasons as well. We want to share with you some of the efforts across the government, including the work that's being done in the task force. And most importantly, I think we want to show you why this particular venue and public-private partnership work in general is so effective in driving results. And you'll hear about processes that we've undertaken and learned over the course of 3 years to improve the value of the products to the community, to make them more available to users. That's an ongoing, continuing process. With that, I'm going to introduce the four really great panelists we have. And I believe Edna is on, so I'll start with Edna. Edna Conway is Vice President and Chief Security and Risk Officer for Azure Microsoft Corporation. Joyce Carell, who is a former task force member, is now Senior Technology Advisor to the National Cyber Director, Office of the National Cyber Director, Executive Office of the President. Laura Hirschon is Management and Policy Analyst at the National Risk Management Center, part of CISA. And Melissa Newman is Vice President for Government Affairs with the Telecommunications Industry Association, TIA. So let's get right to the discussion. And I'm going to open it up with a question to Edna. And that question is, what lessons can we take away from the COVID-19 pandemic impact on ICT supply chain security and resilience? And how will models like just-in-time inventory management and concentrated supply sourcing evolve because of the lessons we've learned? Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. I'm certainly privileged to be here. Look, I'm going to bring my lens of a hyperscaler provider to what I answer. But with that said, The reality is that a couple of essential truths really were reinforced by our learning from COVID. And one is something that everybody should know: supply chains are more connected than ever. They're not ever going to stop being connected. And what that means is something that was near and dear to the heart of this task force, a demand for more information sharing. And in fact, something that CISA has been trying to enable for an extended period of time meaningfully across the public and private sectors. And I would argue that perhaps it also means we need to start thinking about sharing resources among certain supply chain members as well. There's a way to do this when you put things into a pool, and we all have, from time to time, excess inventory. There's a way to think about true demand across a supply chain rather than at an enterprise level. I think the other thing that we saw is, most of us grew up with somebody at some point in our early years telling us, you probably should save for a rainy day, right? The ultimate personal continuity guidance. And the concepts of just-in-time inventory management and lean manufacturing and Kanban analysis, and quite frankly, the mantra of the last, probably almost 18 years has been carry minimal buffer inventory. Those things might have been taken to an extreme, and COVID pointed that out. So the point of what we think about from the task force perspective on risk management is a balanced approach to risk. And so many of the deliverables have included that and a vast array of tips and techniques that members of the community can take. And then finally, we need another balance, a balance across globalization, cost, or sometimes expertise arbitrage, where we might go to a particular region because that's where the experts are, and nationalism, right? The risks of allowing one region to dominate in a certain technology or capability, boy, did they come out loud and regularly, not just during COVID, but we're still seeing it. And we were seeing those trends before. But because of the acute awareness that COVID brought to the table, I think what we figured out is not every nation can have everything. Hence, the power of alliances becomes inherent to our collective success at a national level, at a global level, and at enterprises engaging in that kind of alliance.
Thank you, Edna. Laura, in year 2 of our project, you led an effort to study the impact of COVID-19 globally on our supply chain. Can you talk a little bit about the findings? Are they still relevant today? And what you think can be done to alleviate some of those issues?
Sure, Robert. Thanks for tossing this over to me. And I'm going to touch on a lot of what Edna just said and reinforce it. As Robert mentioned, we did study the pandemic in the task force. That study is up on the task force website. In addition, DHS responded to Executive Order 14017 with the Department of Commerce on America's supply chains, where we also studied the ICT supply chains in great detail. That's also up on the task force website. And so we found that, a lot of the stress points that occurred early in the early stages of the pandemic, while they've lessened somewhat, they still hold very true right through today. And in addition to inflationary pressures, there were 3 sort of major stress points that have impacted the ICT supply chain. The first, as Edna touched on, was inventory management. The typical approach emphasizes the need to strike a balance between efficiency and resiliency. And because of increased competition and compressed profit margins, supply chain managers are often driven to emphasize cost reduction and therefore just-in-time deliverables and days of supply inventory management. Large firms, when they hold too much inventory on their books, they can get dinged by Wall Street. Just-in-time benefits smaller companies. that just don't have the capital to purchase large amounts of inventory. And in these studies, we talked to a number of ICT companies in both, small and medium-sized businesses through to the multinational companies. Each industry carries varying amounts of inventory, and the ICT industry typically carries 3 to 12 weeks of inventory. And while lean supply chains really work well in times of normalcy, as I mentioned, the pandemic demonstrated that it really works well when there's flawless production and execution. And so during the pandemic, when there were lockdowns, transportation issues and quarantines and so forth, the system really did break down. So as I also mentioned, the trend in talking to companies is underway to hold more buffer inventory. Again, that's a little easier for the larger firms, more difficult for the small and medium-sized businesses. The second issue that really came to the forefront was the importance of understanding your supply chain, so supply chain transparency. The ICT system really has a complex and vast networks that make it difficult to identify the vulnerabilities and interdependencies. And so large multinational organizations can have hundreds of tier 1 suppliers. And then the whole network, and those tier 1 suppliers in turn rely on hundreds of other tier 2 suppliers. And so for a large company, by the time they get to the end and through the deepest tiers of their network, they can have tens of thousands of companies supplying for their end use products. So it is extremely difficult to navigate that. And again, we always look at the small and medium-sized businesses too. It's extremely difficult for them to get a complete picture of their supply chain. So when, industry, when the system shut down, the cascading impacts were very, very difficult for companies to figure out where and why the delay was happening. And so the cascading effects really had of understanding the supply chain, figuring out where things were being held up was really difficult. And so also in addition, manufacturers often change their sources of supply on a monthly basis, right? To get, to improve their costs and agility. So it's really hard when things are changing that quickly to figure out where things are being made and who's supplying whom. And oftentimes a lot of vendors share other vendors. And so it's a very difficult proposition. And then also, obviously, as we've all seen, when, the single region, single source issue is very difficult. A single end user product, such as a computer, can be designed, manufactured, and assembled in various countries. We've had a hollowing out over the last 30 years of our manufacturing sector, which is, relocated to Asia. In fact, from January of 97 to June of 2009, our advanced manufacturing in the U.S. lost over 2 million jobs. And so we've lost that ecosystem. And a lot of it is concentrated in Asia. And so when things are sourced from only a single region or through a single source, it makes finding alternative workarounds really, really difficult. This lack of flexibility has had, some devastating impacts. And supply chain managers often do realize that they have an over-reliance on a single source, but they've adopted this strategy in order to secure the necessary supply that they need or to control the costs, or in many cases, they just don't have any other options. Currently right now, I know folks are watching in China right now, COVID-19 cases are rising at the fastest pace since late May. And I know that investors and companies are nervous that there may be a repeat of that 2-month lockdown in Shanghai, which, really adversely impacted the global supply chain. So I know that folks probably on the phone are watching that carefully. So, those are the findings that we found initially in the early stages of the pandemic, and I think they hold true today.
Laura, just a sentence or two, because I don't know if you've captured the transparency item.
Yeah. So I was saying the ability to look beyond your tier 1, your tier 2 suppliers and understand. As I think I just mentioned, they can have hundreds of suppliers for any one product, end-use product, even thousands, and mapping that is extremely difficult. And it's definitely harder for the small and medium-sized businesses as well. The transparency is very, very occluded.
Great. So thank you. Let's go to our other government official. Joyce, you're in a very interesting perch at the National Cyber Directorate. I still think I call you sometimes employee number 6 at the Directorate, and growing. What are your observations about where the United States is right now with regard to our economic exposure, geopolitical exposure, operational business exposure to the supply chain situation?
Thanks for the question. Let me start my answer with giving a quick rundown on my organization, and then address your question a little more broadly. I'm in the Office of the National Cyber Director, which is a brand new organization at the White House. It was created through legislation by the hard work of the members of the Cyber Solarium Commission, which is a bipartisan commission looking at cybersecurity and how the nation is postured to deal with cybersecurity incidents and plan for the future. So one of the recommendations coming out of the work of that group was to create an office at the White House and create a particular position, that of the National Cyber Director, to provide advice to the president. Like any new startup organization, we have been doing the types of things that brand new organizations do, which is writing policies, hiring people, finding space for the hired people to sit. So we're still growing. We're approximately a year old now, and we're in the process of now beginning to exercise our convening authorities to start advancing issues in the cyber domain. Regarding your broad question, and following the observations made by Edna and Laura, I want to point to the work on Executive Order 14017, America's Supply Chains. When this administration was sworn in, that was one of the first actions that President Biden took, was to issue an executive order to really look at how, as a country, we're postured, in 10 different key supply chain areas. Now that these studies have been completed and the recommendations and insights have been shared, both through work with the government and the private sector to get that type of information, we're now in a situation where we have baselined these 10 sectors. So the ICT sector, the energy sector, the advanced batteries, semiconductors, critical strategic minerals and materials, where as a government, we really didn't have this baseline understanding of these sectors in the past, other than in a few areas. For example, the Department of Defense has always had, its thumb on the pulse of access to critical and strategic materials. There's a responsibility in the department to follow that type of information. But these other areas, like the transportation sector, supply chain, were areas that this was new work. So this gives us insight now, on the heels of all the supply chain shocks, to give us the information we need to know what kinds of policy decisions, should we examine from an investment perspective, from a partnership perspective. And I want to tip, Robert, to your question sort of on the geopolitical stage, based on, comments that Edna has made. One of the priorities in our organization is public-private sector partnerships. And that priority focus is going to be looking at how we have historically looked at, the government and the private sector, and what different responsibilities are there. So the private sector produces goods and services for consumption. The government is not producing these goods and services. The private sector are critical infrastructure owners and operators. The government has information, so the government can share information from a warning perspective with the private sector. But we're reaching a point now where the balance needs to shift. So how do we find a way where we're not just coming together? How do we recalibrate this public-private sector partnership, so we're not just coming together and sharing information, but we're actually sitting down side by side and deriving insights together. The information government has with the information industry has, and we share that but we also, in real time, look at how to improve that by deriving new insights. And there are models that we're trying to build out these new ways of collaboration, like the JCDC at CISA, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative is one example. So I think we're at a turning point in a number of ways, geopolitically, from all of the supply chain shocks. And now with this new organization and a heightened focus on cyber more broadly, we're going to be changing the way we do things. And these changes will sort of set the stage for the next decade.
Great. Thank you very much. And finally, Melissa Newman, I think your association and your membership, I don't know if you want to call them the victims or what, but they are, or beneficiaries of these challenges. But you have significant insight, I think, into what's happening and what can be done and what you're doing. So please share.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I do want to step back for a minute and just spend a minute noting that what role the ICT sector played and continues to play in dealing with this pandemic. Our country's networks helped power telehealth services, enabled us to work from home, ensured that kids still got an education when schools were closed. I do not think all of this would have been possible 10 or 20 years ago with the networks and the speeds we had then. I think it highlights the robust investments that the network operators have made and the innovation on the part of equipment manufacturers that our networks excelled so well during this amount of explosive and exponential traffic growth. And just to underscore this point, we know Europe did have to throttle back some streaming services. We did not have to do that, and that is called resiliency. I am very proud of our entire industry and ecosphere. We all talk about supply chain diversity. It's being talked about even more so clearly for the members that we represent at TIA, the equipment manufacturers and the ICT sector. It is a very important issue. But we do have to be mindful about security and ensure that the supply chain is trusted and secure. As we all know, with the rise of attacks on our nation's networks, industry and the government has to work together to ensure that these networks are secure. And I want to reiterate what Joyce said, which it's not just sharing information, but it's working collaboratively on what we can do about it. And I think later on we can talk about some of those things. We at TIA have a saying that security can't be bolted on. It really has to be built in from the get-go. And as we talk about the diversity of the supply chain, as new technologies are developed, potentially more vendors that, are coming, we together, and this partnership is a great venue to work together on how to eliminate, reduce, and minimize security risks.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, so the next question, I'd like to talk about efforts across government. And I want to start by just sharing with you, when I think of supply chain and I think of the government, I have to consider, in my case, my regulator, the FCC, but every other sector has to think about their regulator, the United States Commerce Department, their entities under the Commerce Department, NIST and NTIA, the Department of Defense, which has its own supply chain initiative, Department of Energy, CISA, and I can go on and on. So I think this is a perfect question for you, Joyce, in your capacity as national, in that role as the National Cyber Directorate and responsibilities for overseeing the breadth of activities. What can you tell us about your view of the activities across the government, and what can we hope for over time to see some greater rationalization around How do in that conversation you had about working side by side and sharing insights, deep insights. There are just so many agencies and so many initiatives that we can do that with. Do you agree that we need to make progress in that area, and how are you thinking about that?
Absolutely. So I would say progress in a couple of areas. One of our statutory responsibilities is, the term we're using is federal coherence. So do our federal agencies operating with the authorities that they have been given? Are there gaps in authorities that need to be closed? Are the regulators using their authorities? And have we harmonized those authorities so that we ensure a clear challenge right now is recent legislation on breach notification. How do we harmonize that with what is going on at every single state that might have a different means of breach notification and set requirements? So that's certainly a type of issue that is on our plate. I want to kind of pull back a little bit and say when we look at the breadth of these activities, whether they're focused solely in a supply chain perspective on a procurement, the pointy end of procurement, or the logistics piece of getting goods from point A to point B to then be integrated to deliver a service or a good. We can talk about doctrine, how we organize ourselves. We can talk about technology, are we resilient? But people, the people piece is also a key element in this particular domain. And I believe a recent number I heard was there are over 700,000 cyber jobs, going vacant right now. So one of the things that we're doing is focusing on this. It's a priority area for us. We're going to lead the development of a national strategy for cyber workforce development. We're actually hosting a summit next week. There will be media coverage, so please keep your ear to the ground to hear a little bit more about that. After the summit, we'll be able to provide information on how interested stakeholders can participate in follow-on activities. But in this particular space, I'm going to give you sort of a quick rundown on how we are kind of framing the people piece of this whole cyber domain. So we look at what I'm going to refer to as the few, the many, and the all. The few are those people who are those that truly need to have a computer science degree and have real experience either doing capability development or as a network operator or network defender. So there are jobs that truly require hardcore cyber skills, and those are the few. There's a larger set of individuals or jobs that I would call cyber adjacent, that we would call them many, where there are, for example, if there's a criminal activity, you need investigators that know how to investigate the crime, the criminal activities of ransomware actors. You need attorneys who know how to, prosecutors who know how to speak in front of a jury, in front of a judge in a coherent way about very complex, technology topics. So there are people in cyber adjacent jobs that need very, very specific knowledge, but don't actually have to have a computer science degree. And then we think more broadly, we think about the all, and we think about our society writ large, those who really want to capitalize on the richness of what the initial promise of the internet. So what are the skills that the average citizen needs to have so they can operate safely in this new digital ecosystem that we live in? We spend time, teaching our children not to put their hand on a hot stove, basic survival skills, but we don't do the same in teaching people how to operate safely in this technology environment. So the work that we're going to be leading with our sort of summit as a launch platform next week will bring together stakeholders from across the employers, government and private sector. We're all looking to hire from the same human capital pipeline. So employers, educators, of 4-year academic institutions, 2-year community colleges, non-traditional trainers like those companies that operate cyber boot camps. And the variety of not-for-profits that are also in this particular space. What can we do to really improve and develop the pathway that will let anyone who wants to have a cyber job or cyber adjacent job know how to find that job or know how to get trained and find a way to connect themselves to a job. So what is the path, the on ramps and off ramps, for that? So I welcome all of you to all of the folks in the audience to see what we're doing next week, and if this is an area in which you're passionate, and I'm sure with all these vacancies, this is a growing field. The demand and growth, the 700,000 number, I'm sure is a softball number. So I'm just going to wrap that up. That's the people piece of doctrine, technology, and people.
Yeah. Okay. Laura, CISA is doing a lot on supply chain. You personally have been involved in the executive order implementations, the reports. You've included industry in a lot of the development activities. How do you see the role of CISA evolving in the supply chain space? And I'd also like to ask you, how do we continue to bring vibrancy to the task force?
Yeah, and I'll be brief because I know we're running out of time. So let me quickly step through that. Yeah, so we view industry participation, Robert, as absolutely critical and essential to our work. I cannot emphasize that enough. We recognize that most of the ICT critical infrastructure is privately owned and that we must work together to increase the ICT sector and supply chain resilience. And so neither, as Joyce mentioned, neither the government nor the private sector can operate alone in a vacuum if we want to reduce risks. So we here at CISA are always urging industry to get involved, to participate in the dialogue, pull a seat up at the table. We hear what you have to say. We want to obtain your feedback. We care about what you think, and we listen to what you say. We understand that businesses desire a level of certainty and consistency so that your organization can make plans. You need that sight line and that stability, especially when you're planning your longer term capital expenditures. We understand that, and we will always here do our best to make sure that is part of the decision equation. We may not always get it right. We're trying, and we're making the decisions that we believe are in the nation's best interests. So you'll hear us talk about that a lot. And so we need to hear from you when you think we got it right, where you think we're missing something important, and where you think there are probably opportunities for improvement in the decisions that we make. So again, we view this as a team effort. As Robert mentioned, you may be overwhelmed that there is a lot of activity occurring across government, and there are a lot of issues that are probably important to you. I know it's sometimes confusing to figure out who's doing what and how best to get involved. So I just wanted to provide you with some of the frameworks that we here at CISA have established and that we work, and that may give you some sense about what we're doing. We have established a critical infrastructure and security resilience program that is grounded in these public-private partnerships and collaboration. And that's based on the recognition that ensuring that security and resilience of our critical infrastructure is a shared responsibility, and we really view these public-private partnerships as a foundation. So there's something called the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, or the NIP for short. And that established a partnership framework that enables, federal, state, regional, local, tribal, territorial, and international governments to work together with each other and also the private sector. So to align and to help implement the NIP, DHS created CPAC, the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council, which supports a legal framework for that collaboration. So through that alliance, we have what's called the sector coordinating councils, which enable critical infrastructure owners and operators, or trade associations and other industry reps, to interact on a wide range of sector-specific strategies. There's a counterpart called the government coordinating councils, which is the government counterpart to the SCCs. And then we have cross-sector councils that promote the coordination, communication, and sort of the oversight, if you will, of what each is doing. All of this information is detailed on CISA's website. If you're interested in learning more about these organizations or perhaps joining a council, I'm going to drop an email in the chat, and we'll forward it to the relevant SCC. I'm sure most of you are interested in the IT-SCC and the comms-SCC. Each SCC is responsible for approving membership. Real quick, I wanted to tell you another way to get involved is through organizations like the task force, who is putting on this webinar. There's tons of great leaders and industry members, and we're producing wonderful products that we hope organizations are using. So always check back for that through that website to look for those products that I think really help increase resilience. And there was a lot of hardworking folks from industry and government on those committees that are trying to push these issues forward. In addition, you'll keep checking like Federal Register notices, for example, that the government posts from time to time on where we need input on various matters. For instance, there's some series that CISA is putting on tomorrow. We're doing public listening sessions to help build a software bill of materials on specific SBOM topics. We view industry participation in that as critical. Some of the listening topics will include cloud and online applications, sharing, exchanging SBOMs, tools and implementation, and on-ramps and adoption. We will serve as a facilitator in those sessions, and the participants will drive the outcome and figure out what the next steps are. Some of those sessions have already occurred this month, but I know that there's some tomorrow and throughout the month of July. I really urge you to join and make your voices heard. I'll also drop that link into the chat box for any of you that want to participate. So those are some of the ways, Robert, that we urge people to get involved through the SECs, the task force, listening sessions, but I'll flip it back over to you because I know we're running out of time. Thank you.
Yeah, so what I want to do is I've managed to, as I often do, conflate certain questions. I want to give industry a chance now, and I want to pick up specifically on a point you made, Laura. So I'm going to start with you, Melissa. What is the government doing right? Where can there be some improvements? And what is the role of industry in solving for some of these problems?
Well, thanks, Robert. So look, I will talk about one government effort that I think is going very well. NIST recently issued a request for information regarding its cybersecurity framework and cybersecurity supply chain risk management. This is important work that NIST is doing, and we appreciate the fact that it's looking at security in a holistic way, which is really important, as well as including supply chain security in the discussion. So we are participating, TIA and its members are participating in that, and we look forward to seeing the update for the cybersecurity framework. Industry plays a vital role because we are uniquely understand the intersection between certainly maintaining secure networks and continuing to foster innovation. Those two things go hand in hand. And I think industry itself has an insight on how to do that. And something at TIA, we've been doing standard setting and development for over 80 years, keeping those two things in mind, security and innovation. And one thing we've done, and we've been working on this for the last 2 years, and we're very proud of the work that our volunteers and participants have been doing, is we created, this working group created the first ever process-based supply chain security standard. We call it SCS 9001 for the ICT industry. And what's important about this standard and what makes it different, it is verifiable, it is measurable, and independently certifiable. We talk about we need more transparency in the supply chain. This standard has a lot of protocols that allow for more transparency in what is, as we have discussed, a very complex and global supply chain. And as Edna said, it's not getting less so over time. One of the unique features of this particular standard is that it includes anonymous benchmarking methodologies. And we have found at TIA in our other standard setting development processes that this benchmarking methodologies actually drives continuous improvement in security. So that is a unique feature to the standard as well. We align this standard with the President's 3 executive orders that we have talked about, some of those executive orders on this panel, and relevant NIST standards. So it dovetails precisely with what the government is interested in, what we need to do together to secure the supply chain. And so this is the partnership where we work together. I truly believe in industry standards, taking the industry standard and working with government on the things that they are concerned about through their executive orders. So, and someone just put in the chat line, what is the name of the standard? It is SES 9001. So together, that is the partnership that I think works best.
Very good. Thank you, Melissa. So, as is often the case, Edna, you are kind of unique in that you bring the total practitioner perspective to these discussions, which are often overloaded with some of the policy people, more often than not. From your perspective, as running the, overseeing the supply chain operations for Microsoft and Azure, what do you see that's working? What do you see where there's areas of improvement? How do we avoid wasting time? How do we make sure we derive the greatest value from both the industry resources that are being devoted as well as the government resources?
Yeah, well, that's a question for the ages, isn't it now, Robert? I think there are a number of things that we've already done really well. And I have to applaud the creation of CISA as an agency and its growth and its, quite frankly, unique perspective in the way in which it's trying to embrace the public sector and extend that embrace to the full spectrum, as Joyce was talking about, of harmony across agencies in the U.S. government, and in fact, inviting in ally governments as well, so that we start to look at things that you heard Melissa talk about, benchmarking, best practices, frameworks in which to engage in that conversation, because otherwise the conversation gets lost in the details. That's all something that we've been doing fairly well. Can we get better at it? Of course. But I do think that the broad view from multiple U.S. government lenses have come to the table with the perspective of, at least in our task force, two sectors, comms and IT, gives us a very wide aperture for insight, challenges, right, and what's shared. And let's be honest, everybody has an equal footing. So you can, I'm sitting at the table, Microsoft, with somebody who has a very small business. And that equal footing is something that I think is a very important feature that these kinds of public-private partnerships bring together meaningfully and allow all to speak and be heard. And some of us actually wrap our arms around those smaller businesses as we're thinking about it. What could we do better? And you've heard me lament this, many times. It would be really great if we had, and in no way is this dismissive of our great policy folks or attorneys. I mean, I am one. But for those of us who are, most of my friends will tell me not anymore. It's been way too long. But the reality is having those who operate at the table might allow us to course correct. And you've known me to ask a question or two publicly in a meeting and say, stop. How many of you actually run a manufacturing line or dealt with this issue and are aware of exactly what you're talking about in the broad context and its actual practical ramifications? We have plenty of that talent sitting here in our nation today, from small to medium to large. So inviting those folks, rather than only government affairs and those who serve a very valuable purpose as trade associations, allows the richness of the conversation. It's not to say policy folks and government affairs folks from enterprises and trade associations shouldn't be there. But if you can, invite more of the geeks of the world to sit there and tell you, well, let's just scratch our heads for a minute and think, I see where you want to go, but if you do it this way, I always like to talk about the laws of physics, Robert, right? An unstoppable force meeting an immovable object something's going to get bloodied in that process. So what if we move the actual immovable object? Isn't that the real win together, right? And cloud right now is this interesting blend of a bit of a whole host of private sectors, and every industry is relying on it, and many democratic nation states are relying on it, and others are relying on clouds that they've created themselves. We sort of sit at the pivot of the opportunity for all to be looking at one platform, one model, one framework, and, as Melissa said, international standards together. And I'll close with, I'm a big fan of Joyce's word, harmony.
Very good. Look, I'll step out of moderator role for a second and just say that I think the CISA DHS task force has been an exceptional model of a partnership that works. I don't think we would have ever gotten to year 3 of projects if it hadn't demonstrated some value to the government and industry. I also want to do a foot stomp on the fact that since year 2, we have a separate small and medium business group that has been looking at the specific interests of that community and working to tailor some of the products to make them more digestible for that community. And that will continue. I have one question for the group from somebody here. It says it was noted that security cannot be bolt on, but so much of the ICT infrastructure is foundational and may not be updated for years. So how do we add security to what's in existence versus just focusing on new technology? Who wants to take that on? In other words, we've got a lot of legacy stuff out there.
Go ahead, Melissa.
Okay, since it was my quote. You have a lot of legacy stuff out there, and there is a process we think to go through about where does that legacy stuff come from. And I'm not saying it's an easy process to do, but we want to understand the underpinnings of the supply chain. And so it takes work, but there are tools available to go through that. And it is also a continual process. We get that, as things develop, you'll be able to do more and more, and it may be harder to figure out some of the legacy stuff. But it's worth trying, and it's worth noting that there is always improvement over time. So nobody expects to get, 100 or A+ the first time around, but we have to start.
Mm-hmm. Edna?
Yeah, so I'll add to that because I think I know where this question came from, and it's a very prudent one. Again, I'm going to go back to the operators. How about we start to actually measure our performance around security? So if we look at performance holistically overall, which embraces the outdated, one might argue, but at least still functioning, right, infrastructure that we have and the new technology, and create things like a scorecard or a metric that includes security at every step of the way, that becomes part of the way in which you do business. Security is no longer thought of as an afterthought. And so for me, getting myself embedded into supplier scorecards, or actually reporting to the board on where we're at on tolerance levels, has been a very important journey to say, there are some things that don't move, and there are some things that move much more slowly. Just think about space as an example, real space beyond LEO. That has its own challenges from a physical perspective. So I'd add on to what Melissa prudently articulated to say, build it into your operating performance metrics, and you'd be amazed at what happens with that which is outdated.
I think too, Edna, this is Laura, I think in just being here at CISA, where we think about these things day in and day out, what we've noticed, so someone put in the chat, the Oldsmore, attack at the water treatment facility, these are places with very limited budget. They don't always have a CIO, CTO. So we we spend a lot of time working with small, medium-sized businesses or organizations on these topics, right? The legacy systems. And I think that there, as you mentioned, there's just probably a distinction between Microsoft and the small and medium-sized businesses, and getting those folks that don't have the resources to figure out how best they can help themselves. I think we spend a lot of time in that. The question here is, in the task force anticipating the need to study that? I think that's come up many times in our discussions. Didn't know if you had any thoughts, just being at a large company, if your perspective on that.
Are you asking me that?
Yeah, no, I'm just, it's something that we've discussed in the task force, and it's something here at CISA. There is a disparity between what the large companies and the small companies could do. I guess I'm just making that point.
And
not that anyone needs to answer it. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's really obvious. And how do we bridge that? And I think the fact that task force has taken that on is an important contribution. So we only have a few more minutes. Let's use this as an opportunity for closing remarks. Joyce, I'm going to turn it to you, if you don't mind. Any comments to wrap up what you've heard here, what you wanted to communicate?
Yes, thank you. So kind of wrap up the comments that Edna and Laura were making about, how do you bake in security, throughout the process. I think that's very important. I think we're going to be seeing the insurance industry as the insurance industry is adjusting, no pun intended, to what incidents that occur and claims that are being made. The ability to be able to measure how you have addressed security is going to be really important if you face some type of an incident and you need to file a claim. The notion of zero trust architecture is a concept that we are rolling out across the executive branch for executive branch agencies, and that kind of fits into this notion of security at every step of the way. To those who made the observations about how do you evaluate vendors, think through what are technical factors and non-technical factors. I think that's sort of the benchmark that we use for evaluating vendors, to include those that are startup companies that don't have a long track record, to show that they can deliver a secure product developed in a secure ecosystem. Quick wrap up for those who made the observations about discrepancies between hiring cybersecurity professionals and what you have when you come out of college. That is exactly one of the issues that we're going to be addressing. How to solve that and find a way for someone with a 2-year degree and some experience, or a 2-year degree and no experience. Is an apprenticeship a good idea? Is some type of mentorship program a better idea? What are the different options? What's the broad toolkit for education, training and awareness broadly? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to give, I know Mara wants to close it. So Melissa, can you do it in 1 minute? Any closing remark?
Yeah, I can do it in 1 minute. The BEAD program, with the notice of funding opportunity for the $42 billion for infrastructure, has in there a requirement for supply chain risk management and cyber risk management plans in order to get funding. This is the first time, I believe, in any funding from the government, security was specifically put in there. And I will say that I agree with everything Edna said about benchmarking and drives continuous improvement and zero trust. It's all stuff that we at TIA looked at and is part of our standard. But there is a growing, along with the insurance issues that are coming up, there is very much the right emphasis on security, both in the industry and in the government, again, with this unprecedented requirement in the Build America Infrastructure Act and the billions of dollars towards deploying broadband. Thank you.
I will just add that I hope that they get the formula correct for the criteria. Mara, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Robert. And clearly going down to the last few seconds just means how incredible a discussion it was. I hope everyone who was able to participate in the webinar understands the quality of not just the panelists, but also the moderator we had today. You are getting true insights into the cutting edge of how supply chain risk management is being dealt with. These are hard issues. These are really, really challenging. And yet there's useful, practical insights that are already being created through the task force that are accessible on the website, that people are taking those steps and also continuing to tackle the bigger challenges. So just really want to thank everyone for participating today. I cannot emphasize enough how much the public-private partnership is important. Partnerships like the ict-scrm-task-force allow us to have good conversations to tackle these issues together and have developed realistic solutions and tools and plans. So please get involved. Go to the website, download the tools, present us. We always have the feedback. I can tell you it's my team that gets the emails from any feedback that you have from any of the tools. So please send them in. We do look at them. It's important. This group of people, both the federal side and the private sector side, want to make sure the time and effort put into this produces value, because at the end of the day, it's not just the work we do, it's actually putting it into practice across all of our nation's industries. So thank you so much and really appreciate your time today. Hope you've learned something. Hope you are excited about the upcoming webinars on additional products we produce, and please join us again in the future. Have a great day.
Thank you.